Hello, congregational teams. As I said in the introductory letter about the communities of calling retreats this fall, the imaginative focus for our gathering will be on the work of the St. John's Pottery Studio as it offers a set of metaphors for thinking about calling, both our individual callings and those of our congregations. So in this short exploration, I want to share with you how metaphor fits into the discernment process using the framework that Kathleen introduced in September's teaching modules. And then I'll talk about some of the characteristics of metaphor that make it particularly valuable for theological exploration. This teaching is intended as a support for the reflection on the metaphor of the potter and pottery making that will guide our reflections during the upcoming retreats. So, where metaphor fits in vocational discernment. Here's a slide that illustrates where I see metaphors fitting into the whole sequence of vocational discernment, from initial experiences to making at least a provisional choice. The sequence begins at the bottom of the drawing with some kind of experience or set of experiences. This could be a time when you felt unusual joy in an activity or someone else names a skill that you have. The first step in interpretation is to tell a story about what happened. And we actually make many choices just in that one step of creating a narrative of our story. We choose a point of view toward what happened. We develop a story thread, kind of a little plot. So this led to that. We leave some things out. We explain why this feels like a vocationally significant story for us, and so forth. So storytelling and lively listening are the work that many of you were engaged in, particularly last year, as you helped people listen well to others' stories. And just that single practice is very rich. And as you found out, it really knits people together in ways that matter to them. But telling a story is only the first step in discerning a path forward. And that's where the practices of discernment come in. The particular practices that Kathleen mentioned were listening, seeking, waiting, and choosing. Metaphors can play a very significant role in helping to isolate some of the high points in a story and to anticipate where the story might lead. 3 powerful vocational metaphors we used in our gathering last year were the path, the seed, and the aha moment. The metaphor of vocation as weaving came to us from the weaver at St. Benedict's table, and we've been experimenting a little bit with the metaphor of pilgrimage. So let's explore a little bit more about how metaphors work. So, the cognitive theory of metaphor. For a long time, metaphors were studied as ornaments to ordinary, straightforward speech. And sometimes they were even seen as a distraction, even by philosophers who used them very skillfully. And I'm thinking of you, Plato. But in the mid-20th century, interdisciplinary scholars and scientists began to develop what has come to be known as the cognitive theory of metaphor. And you don't need to remember that. But what's important for us as we listen to people's narratives and attempt to help them listen for God's leading in their lives is to understand that metaphors are foundational for human thinking, and especially for building new knowledge upon the basis of what is already known. Metaphors help us think. And to some extent, they become embedded in our thinking. They are not just decorative, and they cannot be replaced by simpler terms. Even the term calling is, of course, a metaphor, and one that some of us have had to work against to help people get over the idea that they will hear a clear voice from heaven telling them what to do. Though some people do have exactly that experience. For most of us, it's a metaphor. for a gradual realization over time of a direction in the world that just feels deeply right. Most of us in this initiative have wrestled with the term calling, but have felt the lack of a more apt term. Vocation is actually a really complex theological idea. It arises from our relationship with God over a long period of time, and it contains within it ideas about God's providence. Does God plan everything out ahead of time? Human freedom or lack of it? Causality, is everything that happens intended by God? The relative power of human beings in light of sinfulness? How salvation occurs in time? Does salvation happen in a moment of commitment? Does it happen at baptism? Does it happen over a long period of time? Our various Christian denominations represented in the Communities of Calling Initiative hold differing views about all of these things, even though we also share a lot of common ground. The theological complexity of calling creates a situation that is ripe for metaphor, because metaphors help us move from something we know, like, say, the experience of walking on a path, to something harder to see and know, like how God is calling us into new experiences and relationships. So, strong metaphors sometimes become dead metaphors. Let me explain what I mean by that. I would not say that a good metaphor is a dead metaphor. So, some metaphors are so apt for the thing that they describe that they practically cease to exist as metaphors anymore and become completely identified with the thing they refer to. The situation of the metaphor of the path is like this, or close to this, and I've had to restrain myself in this very video to keep from making any unintended references to walking or the journey or twists and turns or getting lost. And what I've said up to now about vocation, one of my hopes in creating this video is to breathe new life into some familiar metaphors by helping us hear the is not quality of them. To keep a metaphor alive as metaphor, it's important to remember that metaphors are and are not actually the thing they're compared to. Calling is like a path. And at the very same time, it is also, of course, it's nothing like a path. It's not a path. Apt metaphors are predictive. So the path is a great example of the predictive power of metaphor. Once you have the image of the path, you can explore what kind of a path you feel like you're on. Is it rocky, well-marked, steep, confusing, well-traveled, unfamiliar, dangerous, etc.? And you can use the ways in which you manage an actual path to help you figure out what to do when things get confusing or difficult on your vocational path. Do you need to create a map? Do you need friends on the journey with you? Do you need to consult someone who has walked this way before? The metaphor of the path offers a very versatile means for carrying out finer levels of vocational discernment, because there are so many kinds of paths and so many different ways for a person to relate to a path. But remember, a metaphor is never actually the thing itself. The experience of responding to a calling is often like walking on a path, but it is not actually walking on a path. Vocational discernment requires some inner work that is nothing like walking on a path. Metaphors are and are not like the thing that they're compared to. Exploring how a particular metaphor does not work can actually also give you some good information about the thing you're trying to understand. What about your vocational, I'm going to use the word journey, but what part of it isn't at all like a path? Metaphors reveal and conceal. So this brings us to the fact that metaphors both reveal and conceal the thing you're trying to study. One very fruitful way to work with metaphors is to ask yourself, what does this metaphor show us and what does it hide? For instance, the metaphor of vocation as a seed that's been implanted in us from the beginning conceals the fact of all the experiences that have brought us to make a particular vocational choice. If any of those opportunities or those barriers had not occurred, would we have made exactly these choices? Would a disability keep us from being able to give life to the seed? And yet, there's also a very common sense among people who have deep satisfaction from a calling that I was made for this. This is like a seed that was planted in me from the beginning. One of the complexities of vocation is that opposing things can seem to be true all at once, and metaphors already contain within themselves some of this complexity. Metaphors imply agency or lack of agency. So metaphors also bring with them a set of assumptions and dynamics of relative power or agency. Some of the assumptions that might get brought in with the metaphor of the path are that someone has created the path and already knows where it goes, that everyone who walks on the path will have the same experience, that the path has a purpose and a rationale, that you always know whether or not you're on the path. Because the image of the path is so versatile, it actually lends itself to going against the grain and saying, I'm making my own path, or I just found out that what I've been doing isn't really a path at all. But many metaphors break down when read against the grain like that. An example would be this familiar passage on the potter and the clay from Isaiah. O Lord, you are our Father. We are the clay, and you are our potter. We are all the work of your hand. So there are actually two metaphors here, God as Father and God as potter, with the human being as a child or as the clay. Biblical metaphors, by the way, are often mixed like this, no matter what your 7th grade English teacher told you about not mixing metaphors. But embedded in this particular use of the metaphor of potter and clay is the fact that the potter is assumed to be the one with personal agency, while the clay is at least relatively inert. So Richard Bresnahan in those videos, which you may or not have seen yet, he certainly complicates this metaphor with his discussion of the three elements that speak through his pottery, the potter, the clay, and the fire. But Isaiah was writing from a context in which the people of Israel needed a way to sense and trust the overarching power of God in a time of political weakness. Isaiah's expression of trust in God's creative power was a bold prophetic claim in a time of suffering and confusion and vulnerability. The metaphor of potter and clay is strategic and contextual, but many theological metaphors contain assumptions about power and agency, parent and child, sovereign and people, shepherd and sheep. It's important to note where a metaphor might make discernment difficult by closing off a person's process of appropriate agency. By contrast, the New Testament metaphor of Gentile believers as the adult heirs of God, we see this in Romans 8:14 through 17. So this passage stresses the accountability of the heir to discern how to apply the values of the parent in new situations. In using this metaphor, Paul wants to stress human moral agency. Questions about the absence or death of the parent lead us into our next point, that metaphors have limits. So finally, metaphors have limits. It doesn't usually work to stretch our interpretation to include absolutely everything that the metaphor might suggest. For instance, when Jesus says, "I am the gate for the sheep" in John 10:7, he's making a fairly focused comparison. As the Word, or the Logos, the reasoning of God, he connects God's people with both safety and the nourishment we find out in the wide world. He creates the trustworthy connection between these two realities. But actual gates have no agency of their own, no thoughts, no mercy. It's easy to see the limits on a metaphor like the gate. But it's important to ask ourselves when we have reached the limits on other important vocational metaphors, like responding to a summons, or navigating a maze, or drinking a cup of blessing or tribulation. Every compelling metaphor comes with a set of assumptions and implications, and not all of them are helpful for tracking the unfolding of a person's vocation. So these are some of the characteristics of metaphors that we will be examining and playing with as we attend to the metaphor of the potter, the clay, the fire, and the user. Metaphors are predictive. Metaphors reveal and conceal. Metaphors are and are not like the thing they refer to. Metaphors imply agency and power. Metaphors have limits. The wide variety of biblical metaphors for our interactions with God give us potentially subtle tools for helping people respond to their callings among very different contexts. I hope that the material provided for the retreats will serve as catalysts for moving from your stories into discernment of God's presence and your callings. Thanks so much for listening.